Hello and welcome to Historia podcast with me, Jack Pettit, and our resident historian, Paul Fletcher. Episode 5 now of our Cold War Origin series, and this episode we're going to be trying to answer the question, why was the Truman Doctrine and the idea of containment so important to the development of the Cold War? Fletch?
Jack.
Here we go.
Here we go.
Okay, so let's start. Can you explain how containment became more important in American foreign policy between summer of 45, so Potsdam, to around March 47?
Okay. So as we've mentioned in previous podcasts, Potsdam Conference, July, August 1945. And this new president, Truman, turns up, and he has got to start dealing with the Soviet Union on a personal basis with Stalin at that conference. Now, Truman was a very, very inexperienced politician in terms of foreign affairs. Basically was essentially anti-communist, was emotionally less willing to understand the Soviet point of view than Roosevelt had been. And his experience, as I mentioned previously in an earlier podcast, his experience at Potsdam convinced him that the Soviet Union, and Stalin in particular, could not really be reasoned with, and they were not really sort of trustworthy allies. But Truman didn't fully understand what was going on, didn't understand why things were going on. And so he had a sort of emotional response after Potsdam, which can be summed up by the words, get tough. So just, if you got tougher, waved a bigger stick at the Soviets, somehow they would respond and they would be better and more compliant as allies and more willing to listen to the American point of view. And of course, what Truman really wanted, like most of us, is that Truman wanted an answer. He wanted an explanation of the world around him. I mean, that's probably common for all of us on a personal level as well. And things had certainly got worse by the early 1946. The Soviets were refusing to move their troops out of Iran, where they'd sent troops in World War II to safeguard the oil supply. They were beginning to make demands for bases in Turkey and the Mediterranean. And, Truman just felt as though he couldn't understand what was going on, what Stalin was up to. And, what do you do in any situation where you don't understand what's going on? You find an expert and ask them, whether you go and ask a lawyer or a doctor or a plumber or electrician. Well, that's what happened here. And so they identified one person who they thought would know the answer. This was a guy called George Kennan. Now, George Kennan at the time was out in Moscow. He was at the Moscow embassy. Kennan was considered to be one of the leading experts on Russia and the Soviet Union in the State Department, in other words, in the Foreign Ministry.
So he's American.
He was serving out in the embassy in Moscow from 1933. He'd been out in the 1920s in Riga, which is the capital of Latvia, where because of course the Americans hadn't had an embassy until 1933, but they'd established a sort of outpost in Riga, in Latvia, to try to understand what was going on. So, you look at this guy, and this guy's got a long track record of dealing with the Soviets, and therefore people thought, right, this is the guy who will give us an answer to try to explain what Stalin wants and what the Soviet Union wanted. Well, they certainly got an answer, all right, and this answer was known as the Long Telegram. 8,000 words. For those who are younger than I am, a telegram, I suppose, the closest we'd say to is it's the email of its day. Okay. sent over wires, and it's like a long process to actually sort of create the words that's going to be going. So to create 8,000 words was an astronomically difficult job to do. But that long telegram was sent to Washington and had an absolutely fundamental impact on American foreign policy and the way Americans viewed Russia.
So is that why it's called the Long Telegram?
Because it's 8,000 words, correct? Yes, because it's unusually long. Now, the Truman Institute library actually considers the Long Telegram to be as important in American history as the Declaration of Independence. Wow. And I'll explain later why that is. So what did the Long Telegram say? Well, it basically said, look, it said, yes, it said the Soviet Union is heavily armed. Yes, the Soviet Union is expansionist. Yes, that expansionism was driven by ideology. In other words, communism intrinsically wanted to expand and take over places. And that, yes, you couldn't actually peacefully coexist with the Soviet Union. But what actually Kennan also said was that the Soviets understood brute force, they understood power, and that therefore, if you had enough force, enough power, you could stop them and they would be stopped, and they would stop of their own free will. And he introduced a word which, of course, hadn't been used before in official circles to explain that whole idea, and that word was, of course, the word containment. Now, I don't think we can possibly underestimate the impact this had. This long telegram was printed off and it was circulated to hundreds of VIPs, within the government in Washington.
So it still get private.
It still kept private, but it's circulated within the government, gets to Truman, gets to leading figures, within his administration. And they all look at this and think, wow, this is it. This is the answer. We have the answer. Okay. And so therefore, in 1946, the American government basically accepts Kennan's view and Kennan's explanation of Russia's behavior as its own official policy. This is reinforced, this process is reinforced during 1946, when in March 1946, Churchill makes his Iron Curtain speech, basically saying that Europe has now been divided, and it's been divided by this metaphor, the Iron Curtain, and behind the Iron Curtain there is, Eastern Europe, and it's now being controlled by this nasty man, Stalin, and this communism is a threat to Western Europe.
So Churchill makes this speech in America.
He makes that speech in America, yes.
No longer Prime Minister.
He's no longer Prime Minister, and he makes that speech. But although he's no longer Prime Minister, the Americans have a huge deal of respect for Churchill. Great wartime leader, a man of great influence. And I think the point about that speech, the importance of that speech, is it reinforced to Truman, a comparative newcomer on the international stage, that what he was reading from Kennan was correct. So it confirmed, if you like, his prejudice, his bias.
Do we know if Churchill knew about the Long Telegram?
We don't. That's a matter of debate amongst historians. Some think that, in actual fact, that Truman allowed Churchill to say what he said to get more people to accept the idea of containment. Other people think that the speech was actually having an impact on Truman. So it's not clear. But whatever way around, it certainly had an impact. And we can see the impact because, of course, we said March 1947. In March 1947, Truman went to Congress, okay? And he made a speech to Congress. And the point of that speech was that he wanted Congress to approve $400 million in aid to Turkey and especially Greece, in order that those governments could fight communists. In particular, Greeks had a civil war which had been going since 1945 between the government and the communists within Greece. And Truman made this speech, and Truman justified this aid to Congress in grounds of the containment. He used the containment explicitly, saying that it was America's job to stand up to communism throughout the world.
So here we've got the development of American policy. American policy politically here is we must contain, i.e., stop the spread of
Yes.
communism.
Yes, correct.
But it's got an economic twinge to it.
Not yet. It will have.
Right.
It will have later on that year. But the point is that speech goes down in history as the Truman Doctrine.
Doctrine meaning
the philosophy, the set of ideas,
Sure.
what you're going to do, and that Truman Doctrine, that speech, is justified by this idea of containment, and it marks the start of containment. That the way of dealing with Russia or Soviet communism is to contain it at every opportunity. It marks the start of that as being central to American policy.
Okay, brilliant. So let's answer the question, right? So why was the Truman Doctrine then, and the idea of containment, so important for developing the Cold War? And in some ways, well, in all ways, worsening relations between the superpowers.
Okay, so in the short term, hugely important because it's containment that is the justification for Marshall Plan and that year, and then Marshall Aid, which is being given out from 1948. Okay, obviously massively important in the development of the Cold War. You therefore get containment also being used as the justification or the rationale for standing up to Stalin in the Berlin blockade and the Berlin airlift. You get, again, containment is the rationale, the justification for the formation of NATO. These are all steps being taken to stop what's seen as Soviet aggression. It has to be done. It's the only way to contain it, okay? Yeah? Then, of course, you get it being applied to further afield. So when the Chinese Communist Party wins a civil war in China, what's America's reaction? Oh, it now had to stop communism there. It had to contain it. So that explained why, therefore, the Americans put the 7th Fleet in to protect what was then known as Formosa, and we now know as Taiwan, which is where the sort of nationalists had fled to. And the Americans said, no, we're going to protect that. We're not going to allow you to take Taiwan. And we've still got that today, with the Americans still protecting Taiwan against the Chinese, communist China. Look at Korea. So North Korea invaded South Korea. What happened? The Americans then got involved in the Korean War. Why? Because it's an example of containment.
Sure.
And so what containment therefore does fairly quickly is it begins to not only, well, it begins to make the Cold War into a more global thing, because the Americans see this as not just about containing communism within Europe, and that's obviously a big thing, but they also begin to see it as they've got to contain communism wherever it turns up, right the way across the board.
So not just Russian communism or Soviet communism, but also
they see all communism, even Chinese communism, as being linked back to Moscow, as being inspired by the Soviets.
Sure.
Now, so that's the sort of short term, and that's really massive, massive importance. But why, if you go back to what I said before, why do the Truman Institute Library consider the long telegram to be as important as Declaration of Independence? Well, the thing is that the long telegram and the idea of containment actually underlies or underpins the whole of American foreign policy between March 1947 and 1990 and the end of the Cold War. And that is that the attitude toward the Soviet Union and communism must be one of containment, must be one of opposing it. You can't understand Vietnam without seeing that that's part of containment. You can't understand why America gets involved. You can't understand why does America blockade Cuba and pick an argument with Cuba without seeing it's about the stopping of the spread of communism, containment. Likewise with the Soviets getting into Afghanistan later on in the early 1980s. Then all of this is about containment. It runs as a consistent theme throughout the Cold War and explains the Cold War. And it's so important that even in the 1970s, when you get an attempt to diffuse the crisis, the tension between the two, called détente. Well, détente at the end of the day fails and is abandoned by the Americans. Why? Because détente is seen as undermining containment. The Soviets were getting ahead in the nuclear arms race as the Americans saw it, and also, of course, the Soviets had invaded Afghanistan. And so therefore, when push came to shove, it was containment that won out against détente. You can't understand Ronald Reagan without realizing that Ronald Reagan promises to contain the Soviet Union. That's why he is elected. However, there is one other way in which containment was important, and it's a positive way. Containment was not about rollback. It wasn't about pushing the Soviets back. It was about containing where they got to. And so therefore, in part of containment was an acceptance that the Soviet Union had got what it's got and would keep it. There was not going to be a rollback. And so therefore, one can argue that the importance of containment is that it ensured or helped to ensure that the Cold War remained just that, a Cold War rather than a hot war.
Yeah, really interesting. I haven't thought about it in that way before. Yeah, really interesting. Thank you.
Not a problem.
As always, thanks for listening. Join us next time for episode 6, where we're going to be looking at arguably a consequence of the Truman Doctrine, which is, of course, George Marshall's plan and subsequently his aid to Europe. Thanks for listening.